Hey there, Electoral College fraternity brothers and sorority sisters. It's another episode of Barenaked Reviews. I'm your man, Rishi B. In case you haven't heard, I thought I'd take this opportunity to tell all of you that the winner of the 2016 American election is Donald Trump. What? Presidential elections seem to be becoming more horse racier than the last, and this one in particular felt like the longest and most exhausting ever. Not only did it leave me exhausted, but it left me worried about a number of different topics regarding our election system. And I don't know about you guys, what you do when you're exhausted and worried about politics, but you know what I do? I talk to my dad, who I call Baba. So this episode is a conversation between my Baba and I, where we review American elections until they're bare naked. The topics we discuss are how presidential candidates are vetted, length of the campaign season, selection of the vice president, pros and cons of the Electoral College. Hope you enjoy. Okay. And this is something you brought up, Baba, the vetting of presidential candidates. From my perspective, not being very educated on a lot of the topics here and a lot of how the government works, it seemed to me that a person could essentially just say, hey, I'm running for president, as long as they were able to get on CNN or something. And, sadly, I don't think it's much more complicated than that. Looking this topic up, when you Google how presidential candidates are vetted, the first thing that comes up is a lot of things about how vice presidential candidates are vetted. And the best thing I see about presidential candidate vetting is a forum discussion on Reddit, a social media forum site for those of you who are not familiar with what Reddit is, and also a Yahoo Answers question. Someone asked on Yahoo Answers, hey, how does a presidential candidate get vetted? And someone responded to that. So those are the best things you can find from Googling this topic.
Right. The vetting, of course, we know that the whole cabinet is vetted.
Right.
Everybody who is nominated for different positions are vetted.
Right.
Except for maybe a few that do not require congressional approval, Senate confirmation. But still, when all the important positions, all the cabinet positions are vetted, there is a need to vet the presidential candidate itself.
Right.
Regardless of who it is, public has a right to know about this candidate, good or bad, whatever it is, but we should know about that. Although it could be argued that campaigning for 2 years is long enough for vetting.
Right.
But still, before they declare their candidacy, maybe the party itself do some vetting of whoever wants to run for president before they are allowed to declare their candidacy.
Right. And basically you just need to be able to amass a certain amount of money to announce your candidacy, whichever ticket you're choosing to run for. And that's about it. If you can get some money, and in some ways, yeah, like you were saying, some people might argue that that's the vetting right there, is that's sort of a first obstacle. If you can attract donors, if you can attract money from people for your campaign, then maybe that's some vetting right there. But in reality, a lot of the rocks and a lot of the kind of dirty stuff that comes out, that a presidential campaign is kind of popular and notorious for turning over these rocks and things that, these people don't want to come out from their private lives. A lot of that doesn't come out until much closer to the election.
Right. It is too late at that point.
Right.
And we definitely have noticed that this election cycle. But at least our expectation from our political leaders, they have to have a little higher standard.
Right.
For these important positions they are going after.
Right.
Whether people buy it or not, that's a different issue. But at least our expectation is that. And to that end, I think the vetting is probably a process that needs to be initiated in some form or other.
Yeah, and actually, I'm sure like FBI, CIA, FBI has become very notorious this past 2016 election for its involvement, but having some sort of official department that oversees the vetting process, I think that would go a long way. And in my research, I found that there's the FEC, Federal Election Commission, but their job is to oversee public funding of campaigns. So they're just tracking the money and disclosing campaign finance information. They're looking at what financed the campaigns. They're not really looking into the history of a candidate or,
right.
They don't have any jurisdiction over telling Donald Trump to turn in his IRS tax information. So having something like that, I think, could go a long way. This kind of ties into the length of the campaign season, which is something that a lot of people have been talking about. I mean, running for president is basically a 2-year process. I saw in the news that Ted Cruz, in this past election, he announced his candidacy in March 2015. That was 596 days before the election. And that's one of the
record, probably.
Yeah, and it looks like that's one of the earliest ever. That almost seems like comically long. I don't know what you're going to be doing for a year and a half. And just for a quick history lesson.
History lesson.
Campaigns generally used to be about 11 months before the election. And the pivotal moment was in 1968 in Chicago. The DNC was holding their convention in Chicago, and the party was split between two factions, one that wanted out from the Vietnam War and one that wanted to stay in, the status quo. And the status quo faction ended up winning. And even though they won, though, the American people wanted to have more option to voice their dissatisfaction. And so what the DNC did is they changed the primary rules, which basically allows for more states to have more say as to who the candidates are and which candidates will be backed by the parties. And I think that's where you start seeing stuff like New Hampshire and all these other smaller states. And so I think some people might see that as a pro, that the length of the campaign allows for more states and therefore more people to voice their opinion. One thing that should be noted that I saw in my research, for this past election, the DNC and RNC actually voted that most states should hold their primaries in March prior to the election, but most states ignored that anyways. So the pros that I saw is that the length of the campaign, it allows for more states to sway which candidates are nominated. Then the length of the campaign has increased the amount of money needed to run, and that's what we were talking about, Baba, that the amount of money is being seen as sort of a vetting process in itself.
The length of the campaign probably relate to a lot of stuff. One is, of course, expenses. The longer the campaign, the more money will be spent. And we all know that a staggering amount of dollar is spent every election cycle.
Right.
It has been like $1 billion nowadays.
Right.
Which seems to be way too much for election. And in this day and age when social media and other things, everything is like every news is flashed all over the world right when it's happening. We don't feel like that we need such a long period of campaign, because whatever message candidates are going to throw at public, it will be spread in the airwaves right away.
Yeah.
So we can shorten the campaign time, we can lower the cost, and at the same time, if the candidates are vetted before they declare their candidacy, then we don't need a long period of campaign just to know who these candidates are.
And actually, to your point about the airwaves, I feel like this 2016 election has changed probably forever how candidates announce their candidacy. Probably almost everything will be over social media now. And this sort of traditional way of campaigning, going from state to state and doing your big speeches and all that kind of thing, That's probably going to be old news within the next few elections. It's going to be just Twitter battles between different people. And that's actually a defense for the length of the campaign that I saw, that it allows for new people who aren't necessarily celebrities to gain status and to introduce new ideas.
I think we should look at this shortening of the campaign, because nowhere in the world campaign goes for this long that we know of.
Right.
Some of the parliamentary systems, the maximum length of campaign is 3 months.
Right.
They declare an election date, and then campaign is done and it's over.
So everything sort of has its pros and its cons. And the one thing I saw a con about the parliamentary system is that the prime minister or the leading party basically gets to control when the elections are held. And
right.
So they can have the election held at a time that most benefits their party.
Well, there is a limit, though. The parliamentary system, the election can be called by the party in power, but at the same time, there is a maximum length of time defined in the Constitution, that you have to have general election every 5 years or every 4 years or something like that.
Right.
Obviously, there is no perfect system.
Right.
And I think, if I remember correct, it was Winston Churchill who said once, democracy probably is the worst form of government, but we don't know anything better.
Another thing that I saw that was interesting is election rules. There are rules, but even if a party breaks them, the fines that they're slapped with, that's paid with taxpayer money. Even if you agree or disagree with this length of the campaign should be shortened, definitely needs to be some kind of changing of the rules to make sure that parties are more directly impacted by fines. I guess it kind of depends on your views of the money behind these elections and behind this government. However, it should be noted that Hillary Clinton, she spent more in her campaign than Donald Trump did,
right.
And she still ended up losing. The public doesn't really get a say on the vice president. I saw in when I was reading about this in
History lesson.
Historically, Americans used to be able to pick the vice president via a separate ballot, but then that changed with FDR when he asked the DNC to get behind his hand-picked choice for his vice presidential candidate. I do think that maybe a separate ballot for a vice president would be fair.
I think probably a system can be devised to address this issue. Because just look at the picture for the last few elections. We notice the presidential candidate picks up the vice president of his or her choice, and the ballot is developed based on that. You cannot separate this. So the vice president becomes really not an elected person. It becomes a selection by one individual. Now, remember, the vice president is just one breath away from the president.
Right.
So, the president gets inaugurated, vice president get the job, and everything is hunky-dory. The fallacy of this whole system is that our president will be somebody who was handpicked by one individual, not by the people, because people are forced to vote for him or her.
Right.
Until the next election. Doesn't make any sense in a system that spends so much time campaigning, so much money for this election,
right.
Ends up with a vice president who is handpicked by one person.
Right.
Supposedly it is a democratic process. In this category, it doesn't look like it is really democratic.
Yeah.
It is mostly autocratic.
Right. And I think it kind of ties into the vetting process.
Yeah, the vetting process.
There is
definitely.
no vetting. And one thing that I think could happen after the DNC and RNC, they pick their candidate to run for their tickets. that person works with the party to create a list of like 3 or 4 vice presidents, and then maybe in your ballot you get to vote. And so because now vetting is basically someone gets announced into media, and then it's basically the job of journalists to uncover, old closets and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
That's what it looks like. I don't think that anyone within government is really doing any serious vetting. But if it's basically on the job of the journalist, then how about the presidential nominee for each party gives a list of 3 people, and then once they announce that list, then in the preceding months, all the closets and all the old rocks will be turned over. And then at the time when you're voting for president, you're also voting for which person you want as vice president.
That could be a process. And I think the argument always have been that, well, what if the vice president is not very compatible with the president?
Right.
So that's why it is assumed that the presidential candidate will pick up.
Should get to pick, yeah.
Okay. The whole thing doesn't appear to be a very democratic process.
No. One thing I thought was interesting is after this whole government and everything back in the late 1700s was formed.
History lesson.
The first few presidential elections, the vice president was the person who lost. So can you imagine now if Hillary Clinton was Donald Trump's vice president? I don't think that'd go really well.
Yeah, right.
Whoa there! I just want to take a moment here to remind all of you that you can catch up on more episodes of Barenaked Reviews at rishib.com. I have reviews of Mr. Robot, Doctor Strange. I even have a comedy competition between Simpsons, Family Guy, and South Park. Hey, did you know you can pick a topic for an episode? Indeed you can, my friend, if you give me feedback via the Facebook page or tweet at Barenaked, REVS, or give me feedback on the YouTube page or email barenakedreviews@gmail.com, you will get a chance to be randomly selected to pick a topic. Fan of the show, Jeffrey from Orlando, Florida, he picked a discussion about Westworld, and you can do something like that too. Thank you so much for listening and for your feedback. I love you all so very much, so much that I want to get bare naked. Okay, so ending off now, let's talk about the thing that everyone's talking about, this Electoral College. This is becoming a huge topic for debate, and it's always in some situation like this when someone wins the popular vote but still loses the election.
Right.
So it happened with Al Gore, obviously, and then now Hillary Clinton. And actually, as we speak, they're recounting the votes, so who knows what will happen with that. But I just wanted to list out some pros and cons. Let's start off with pros. Let's start off with some arguments for the Electoral College. Without the Electoral College, and this is actually the main argument that I'm hearing, without the Electoral College, someone could win the election by winning the popular vote from just one region of states, where there's a lot of people. The argument there, and if you look at Hillary Clinton, a lot of this 2 million votes that she has over Donald Trump in the popular vote. I forget, I don't have all the numbers with me right now, but basically that's all from California. That's the argument for keeping the Electoral College, that it basically diversifies the vote.
Yeah, I think the founding fathers devised this system of Electoral College to have the smaller states with smaller population having some say. Now, remember, it was devised some 200 years ago.
Right.
In those days, obviously, population was much less in every state. And population obviously shifted from state to state, and some state became very populous. Example, California, New York, Texas, or others, heavy population there. The smaller states which have fewer population, in no way they are very small.
And actually the problem, and this is the main argument, that one region is voting who's president. But basically the Electoral College has become it's become such a thing now that it sort of has become the problem that it was trying to solve. Yeah. And I think it's what you're saying, that at the time, 200 years ago,
right?
How would the Founding Fathers have accounted for every population and every technological shift? And right now in this system, because of the Electoral College, one Floridian's vote equals 1/3 of the combined vote of Alaska, Delaware, District of Columbia, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. I understand the sentiment that you want to promote minority interests. You want to make sure every person's vote counts. I think that's the main argument for the Electoral College.
So becoming president with Electoral College as opposed to popular vote brings a question here. In a democratic situation, whether some state have a say or not, it will make sense that if it is truly democratic, then the person who wins the most popular vote should be the president.
Right.
Now remember, this is not a lifelong job. It is only 4 years.
4 years, right. So just two things really quickly, that because of the Electoral College, presidents usually pick a diverse vice president.
They always try to do that.
They try to do that, yeah.
And typically, president and vice president are not from the same region, same state.
Right.
It is always from a different state.
Different area. Another thing I thought was interesting, and this kind of goes to what your views of government should be, the Electoral College discourages third parties. So basically a third-party candidate could win 25% of the popular vote and still not gain any electorates. So it kind of promotes political cohesiveness with two parties. So, that's actually both a pro and a con, depending on what your views are of third parties. And they probably would benefit the most from getting rid of the Electoral College.
Absolutely. Like, example, Ross Perot, when he ran against Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, he got 19% of popular vote, which is a lot.
Right.
But he didn't make any dent to anything except that he made sure that Bush doesn't win. Mm-hmm. If he was not in the picture, probably Bush would have won over Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
Maybe there are other thinkers somewhere who would provide a better solution to the national problems.
Yeah.
Third party may not be a bad idea.
Right.
Maybe a fourth party or whatever,
Because right now, basically, and this we see this in the current thing. Basically, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida are like controlling the election.
Yeah. Why should there be a toss-up state?
Right. Yeah.
Popular vote will probably eliminate that toss-up situation. Just because something has worked for 200 years
doesn't make it right.
Doesn't make it right.
Right.
We can think about some different ideas and try that for a while, maybe 100 years down the line or 50 years down the line. If this doesn't work well, maybe we'll come up with another idea.
Right.
But the whole point of this is that we get presidents and vice presidents who would be the better candidates and who would serve the country much better.
And just encouraging people to vote, because just from my own friends and people that I talk to, there's a number of people who, because of the Electoral College, they actually didn't go vote this election because they don't feel that their vote really matters.
Exactly.
And depressing votes can be a tool to win swing states, and there's a lot of criticism that goes against the Republican Party for this. That depressing votes can be a tool to win. I feel like that right there should be a major reason to reconsider this Electoral College system.
Right. And the recounting will be totally unnecessary.
Right.
If you are really winning by a big difference.
Right. That's for sure. Before I wrap up, I wanted to say a couple of thoughts on President-elect Trump's win. I think Trump's victory not only speaks to the aversion for many of Hillary Clinton being president, but it also speaks to misunderstandings on both sides of the political spectrum. On the left, I think it's an implied moral superiority to those who would even consider voting Republican. Being a liberal myself, it's often bothered me how dismissive some people, I agree with politically, can be to even hearing out conservative viewpoints simply because they typically can't see eye to eye on social issues like racism. Because the conservative side hosts a number of people whose public personas are based off of saying sexist or racist comments, it seems like liberals and conservatives can't even meet at the table to negotiate ways to solve the country's problems. Not being a conservative myself, it's hard to say what misunderstandings they have. However, over the past couple months, I've come to know a few people who typically vote Republican and they voted Trump this election. Based off of conversations I've had with them, I don't think all Trump voters are sexist, racist, but I do think there's a misunderstanding on what racism is on the right, and how it's difficult to quantify and solve simply by placing a law. If it were that simple, then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 should have solved everything. Not only is racism burning crosses on a brown person's lawn, but in a larger sense, it's making them feel somehow that they're different, or less than human. For the racism I face, it's typically when I'm reminded I'm brown and I'm talking to a white person. Basically some scenario where I have to pardon my brown. For example, recently I was on the phone with a customer service rep who is an older white woman, and after talking about my issue, she asked me for my name. I told her I'm Rishi, and she said, "Oh wow, your name is different, but you sound so American." Now some people may say that this comment isn't that big of a deal, but what it did is it made me feel like somehow I'm strange and alien, and I'm intruding on this older white woman's turf, even though I'm born and raised in America. "Oh wow, your name is different, but you sound so American." I do sincerely apologize about this, lady. It's really quite embarrassing. I'm just going to have to ask you to pardon my brown.